Story 1. The day was like any other. I woke up to the monotonous hum of the alarm clock, signaling the start of another mundane weekday. I had been living alone in my small, cozy apartment for a couple of years, and while I enjoyed the solitude, little did I know that this particular day would forever change the way I viewed my safe haven. My name is Alex, and I'm your typical 20-something, working a desk job in a bustling city. On that fateful morning, I had reluctantly dragged myself out of bed, slipped into my work attire, and grabbed a quick breakfast before heading out the door. The day ahead promised nothing more than endless meetings, paperwork, and the eternal longing for the weekend. As I stepped out, I exchanged pleasantries with my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a kindly elderly woman who lived in the apartment across the hall. We had developed a friendly rapport over the years, and she often checked in on me when I was home alone. The day at work was as dull as anticipated. Hours dragged on, and by the time I returned to my apartment, I was exhausted and eager to unwind. Little did I know that the evening would turn into a harrowing experience that would haunt me for the rest of my days. Upon entering my apartment, I immediately noticed something amiss. The door was slightly ajar. My heart raced, and I instinctively knew that I had locked it securely that morning. Fear gripped me as I cautiously pushed the door open. The apartment was cloaked in shadows, and an eerie silence hung in the air. I called out, thinking that perhaps I had forgotten to latch the door properly, and that Mrs. Henderson had come to check on me. But there was no response. I slowly made my way through the dimly lit rooms, my senses on high alert. Nothing seemed out of place, and I began to think that perhaps it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That's when I heard it, a faint, muffled noise coming from the bedroom. My pulse quickened as I approached the bedroom door. The noise grew louder, and it became unmistakable. It was the sound of someone crying. I had no roommates, no pets, and no logical explanation for the presence of another person in my apartment. With trembling hands, I pushed the bedroom door open, and what I saw sent shivers down my spine. There, sitting on the edge of my bed, was a young woman, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed uncontrollably. She was dressed in tattered, blood-stained clothing, and her disheveled appearance sent waves of terror through me. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. She looked up, her tear-soaked eyes filled with a mixture of fear and despair. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to go. They were after me." My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. It was clear that this young woman was in desperate need of help, but her presence in my apartment was inexplicable. I cautiously approached her, keeping a safe distance. She introduced herself as Emily, and as she recounted her horrifying tale, my sense of dread deepened. She had been chased through the city streets by a group of menacing individuals, their motives unknown. Desperate and with nowhere to turn, she had taken refuge in my apartment while I was at work, seeking solace in the one place she thought was safe. I couldn't turn her away. Her story was harrowing, and the fear in her eyes was genuine. I offered her some fresh clothes and a hot meal, all the while keeping a vigilant eye on the door, expecting the mysterious pursuers to burst in at any moment. Hours passed, and there was no sign of the individuals who had been chasing Emily. She had calmed down considerably, and we began to discuss our options. It was clear that she couldn't stay in my apartment indefinitely, and she had no friends or family in the city to turn to. As we brainstormed, Mrs. Henderson's friendly face suddenly flashed in my mind. She had lived in the building for decades, and if anyone knew the ins and outs of the place, it was her. I decided to confide in her about the situation and seek her advice. We cautiously made our way across the hall to Mrs. Henderson's apartment. I explained the bizarre events of the evening, and she listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grave. "You did the right thing by helping her, dear," she said in a hushed tone. But you're in grave danger. Those who were chasing her are not to be underestimated. Mrs. Henderson revealed that she had overheard hushed conversations in the building's communal areas, conversations that hinted at a nefarious underground network operating in the city. Emily's predicament seemed to be connected to this sinister group, and Mrs. Henderson feared that my involvement would put me in jeopardy as well. With her guidance, we decided that the safest course of action was to contact the authorities. Mrs. Henderson assured me that she had connections in the local police department and could discreetly inform them of the situation. As we waited for the police to arrive, Emily and I huddled in my apartment, our hearts pounding with anticipation. It felt like an eternity before the officers finally arrived, and they took Emily's statement and assured her that they would do everything in their power to keep her safe. With the police now involved, Emily was placed in protective custody, and I was left to grapple with the surreal events of that evening. Mrs. Henderson's support and guidance had been invaluable, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward her. In the days that followed, the police conducted an investigation into the mysterious group that had been pursuing Emily. Their findings were chilling. This underground network had ties to organized crime, and Emily's knowledge of their activities had made her a target. I never saw Emily again, but I received occasional updates from the police, assuring me that she was safe and in witness protection. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that my once peaceful apartment had been forever tainted by the presence of those malevolent individuals. The incident served as a stark reminder that danger could lurk where you least expect it, even in the supposed safety of your own home. I moved out of that apartment shortly after, seeking a fresh start in a new neighborhood. To this day, I wonder about Emily and what became of her. The memory of that night haunts me, a chilling reminder that sometimes, being home alone can be far from comforting. Story 2. My name is Sarah, and I've always cherished the quiet of my cozy suburban home. It's a peaceful place where I can escape the demands of the world and enjoy my solitude. However, one night, my peaceful haven became the setting for a terrifying encounter that would change my life forever. It was a chilly evening in late autumn when the incident occurred. I had just returned home from work, exhausted and ready to unwind. As I settled into my favorite armchair with a good book, I noticed the time. It was close to midnight. The house was silent, save for the occasional creaking of the floorboards, which had always been a source of comfort to me. My phone sat on the coffee table, its screen dimmed, and my cat, Luna, curled up in my lap. I felt completely at ease, relishing the solitude. Just as I was about to lose myself in the pages of my book, my phone suddenly came to life with a shrill ring. Startled, I picked it up and glanced at the caller ID, which displayed a string of unfamiliar numbers. It was past midnight, and I couldn't fathom who would be calling me at this hour. Hesitant but curious, I answered the call. A static-filled voice crackled through the line, barely audible. "Sarah," it rasped, "I need your help." My heart raced as I struggled to make out the voice on the other end. It sounded distant, almost ghostly, and filled with desperation. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's Mark," the voice replied, and a chill ran down my spine. Mark had been my childhood friend, but he had disappeared without a trace several years ago. The police had conducted an extensive search, but there had been no leads, and eventually, the case had gone cold. I stammered, "Mark? Is it really you? Where have you been all these years?" He ignored my questions and continued, "Sarah, you need to come to the old abandoned cabin in the woods. I'm in danger, and I don't have much time. Please, hurry." The urgency in Mark's voice was palpable, and I couldn't ignore the plea. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at the cabin, despite the late hour and the eerie circumstances. I quickly grabbed a flashlight, my car keys, and woke Luna from her slumber. I told myself that it was probably a prank or a cruel hoax, but a nagging feeling of unease lingered. As I drove through the pitch-black night, the woods felt like an impenetrable wall of darkness. I knew the cabin Mark had mentioned. It was an old, decrepit structure that had been abandoned for years. Why he would be there was beyond my comprehension. When I arrived at the cabin, it was even more dilapidated than I remembered. Moonlight barely filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting eerie shadows on the decaying wood. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I cautiously approached the cabin's entrance. The door creaked open with a spine-chilling groan, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The air was musty and damp, and the silence was broken only by the occasional scurrying of woodland creatures. "Mark?" I called out, my voice trembling with fear. There was no response. I moved through the cabin, checking each room, but found no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Just as I was about to leave, my flashlight beam landed on a torn piece of paper lying on the floor. I picked it up and read the hastily scrawled message. "Run, Sarah. He's here." Before I could react, I heard a chilling whisper behind me. "Sarah." I spun around to find Mark standing in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were vacant, devoid of recognition, and he was holding a blood-stained knife in his hand. Terror coursed through me as I realized that the Mark before me was not the friend I had known. He advanced toward me with an unnatural, almost predatory grace, and I knew I had to escape. I bolted out of the cabin, sprinting through the dark woods with Luna close behind. The night seemed to stretch on forever as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back, for fear of what I might see. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached my car and sped away from the cabin. I didn't stop until I was safely back home, my heart still pounding with fear. I never saw Mark again, and I never found out what had happened to him during those years he was missing. The police searched the cabin but found no trace of him or any evidence of a struggle. To this day, I am haunted by that night, the eerie phone call, the abandoned cabin, and the chilling encounter with Mark. It was a night that shattered my sense of security and left me with an enduring fear of the darkness. The incident remains a mystery, a puzzle with no solution, and a reminder that sometimes, the past can come back to haunt you in the most terrifying of ways. Story 3. My name is Rachel, and I've always cherished the solitude of my rural home. It's a peaceful place where the closest neighbors are miles away, and the only sounds that break the silence are the rustling leaves and chirping birds. But one night, the tranquility of my home would be shattered by a series of eerie events that I can never forget. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I had just settled into my favorite armchair with a book. The wind outside howled through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My faithful dog, Max, lay at my feet, his head resting on my lap. It was the kind of night I relished, a night to disconnect from the world and simply be. As I lost myself in the pages of my book, I suddenly became aware of a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was a whisper, soft and distant, barely audible above the wind. I dismissed it as a trick of my imagination, a figment of the eerie atmosphere. But the whisper persisted, growing slightly louder with each passing moment. Max, my usually calm and collected dog, had now perked up, his ears alert, his gaze fixed on the corner of the room. I strained to listen, and the whisper became clearer, a series of hushed voices, speaking incoherent words. The voices seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as though the very structure of the house was speaking. Fear crept over me as I realized that there was no logical explanation for the phenomenon. My nearest neighbor was miles away, and the chances of anyone being outside my remote home at this hour were slim to none. I cautiously rose from my chair, my heart pounding, and moved closer to the wall where the voices seemed to originate. Max followed closely, his low growl sending shivers down my spine. As I pressed my ear against the wall, the whispers grew clearer. It was as though I could hear fragments of conversations from another time, another place. The voices were disjointed, their words a puzzle I couldn't decipher. My unease deepened as I realized that the whispers were not confined to a single wall. They seemed to surround me, emanating from every corner of the room. It was as though the very walls of my home held secrets, secrets that were now unraveling. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and called the local authorities, explaining the bizarre situation. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the line, and I could sense the skepticism in her tone. But she assured me that an officer would be dispatched to investigate. As I waited for the police to arrive, the whispers continued, growing louder and more frenzied. It was as though the voices were pleading, desperate to be heard. Max paced anxiously, his growls now drowned out by the cacophony of voices. When the police finally arrived, I led them into the house, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The officers, too, could hear the whispers, and their expressions grew grim. They conducted a thorough search of the house, inspecting every nook and cranny, but found no source for the mysterious voices. There were no hidden speakers, no electronic devices, nothing that could explain the phenomenon. They suggested that it might be a structural issue, perhaps the result of the wind whistling through the old walls. But I knew that explanation didn't account for the words, the conversations that seemed to be unfolding. As the officers left, their voices fading into the distance, I was left alone once more with the relentless whispers. Night after night, they continued, their words haunting my every moment, their origins a mystery that tormented me. I sought help from experts, paranormal investigators, and even clergy, but no one could offer an explanation or a solution. I became a recluse, unable to escape the relentless voices that seemed to come from within the very walls of my home. To this day, I remain in my secluded home, a prisoner to the whispers that have become an inescapable part of my existence. I've learned to live with them, to accept their presence as a macabre companion in my solitary life, a constant reminder that sometimes, the true horror lies within the confines of our own home.